In this video, I'll be talking about the proposed tax bill that is under review that is causing a lot of disagreements in the National Assembly. I'll be talking about why some northern governors particularly were against this bill and some things you need to know about some northern governors towards the end of the video, which is very, very key in driving this nation forward. And I will be using simple language as if I'm explaining to a dummy, and I promise you are going to understand everything that the bill is all about, that is really causing the disagreement, which actually concerns me and you if we really want to see this nation move forward. So now let's talk about the current tax reform that Nigeria is currently operating. The current tax reform that Nigeria is currently operating gives 50% of all the tax that are generated in all the states back to the states. So for example, we have 36 people, the state government, giving contribution, maybe monthly contribution. This one brings 10,000, this one brings 5,000, this one brings 2,000, this one brings 500, this one brings 200 naira. So all the money that was brought together, 50% of all the money will be given back to the states. How we they now distribute it? If, for example, all the taxing states contribute 1 trillion naira, 50% of the 1 trillion naira will be given back to the states, and the 50% is 500 billion. So now the 500 billion will be divided into two. 50%, which is 250 billion, will be shared equally. So 50% of the 50% will be shared equally. Now we have 20% will be shared according to derivation, that is, who contributes the most. So now whoever contributes more than other people, now there's 20% allocated specially that they will receive more from there. So now the other aspect, 30%, is actually by population. So even if you don't contribute anything, the 50% out of the 500 billion, which is 250 billion, will be given to everybody equally. If you now have a lot of population, then you also have a chance of sharing even much more in the 30%. But if you now contributed more when others are contributing, it's only inside of the 20% that you can actually get more. So the problem with this method is that some states are contributing more, while some states are not contributing more, and the states that are not contributing are still getting a fairly huge amount of money. A state can actually contribute 1 billion and at the end of the day get 7 billion. For example, in August 2024, Niger State contributed 1.73 billion in tax but received 6.21 billion. And Kaduna State contributed 2.03 billion but received 7.48 billion. Now, Lagos State, which actually the amount that Lagos State contribute actually is like 18 states combined, and they contribute more than 50% of every VAT that is generated across Nigeria. They generated more than 50%. So in August 2024, Lagos State contributed about 249.77 billion, but only received 46.25 billion, which is like 17% of their overall contribution. We also have a state like Oyo State contributed 20.11 billion and only received 9.46 billion. So the system is a little bit rigid again, a little bit not fair to people who are contributing a lot but are receiving a mega amount of money. And so now let's go into a table and see how it's being restructured under the proposed bill that is in place and why some people are against it. Assuming Nigeria is earning 1 trillion every month, 1 trillion every month in VAT. So assuming Nigeria is earning 1 trillion every month in VAT. So now let's look at it under the current model. 50% will be 500 billion. But now the 50 out of the 500 billion, 50% will be shared equally among states. So 50% of 50% is 250 billion. So and shared among 36 states. Every state in Nigeria, every state will collect 6.94 billion per state, including the FCT. But now under the population, 30% So 30% of 50% will be 150 billion naira. So because 30% is under population, every state that has a higher population we also get more money. So 30% is reserved for each state according to their population. So 30% or 50% is 150 billion naira. Shared by population, Lagos State, which actually constitutes about 10% of the Nigerian population, will receive 15 billion naira. And we know that we have many northern states who actually have the highest population, so they share a large chunk of money in this population aspect. And we also have in the equality aspect as well, every state gets equal amount. And then based on derivation is that how much revenue that you contributed as a state, and we only have just 20%. So using Lagos as a model for this derivation again, out of that 20% of derivation, Lagos State out of that 20% for derivation, which is 100 billion, based on VAT contribution, Lagos State actually gets, they contributed more than 50%, or let's say 50%. Lagos State gets 50 billion, which is actually a lot. So now, going with the current model actually allocates 55% to state governments instead of the 50% that we have before. But the method of distribution has now changed. The method of distribution has changed. So now, instead of 50% for equality, so it is now 20%. And instead of 30% for population, it has also reduced to 20%. And instead of 20% for derivation, that is the value that you produced, it has reduced to 60. It has now increased to 60%. That is, they want to encourage productivity, that the more you contributed to the economy, to the VAT, also depends on how much you get. Just like I said in the beginning, as if everybody is contributing money. Now it is the basis of how much you contributed that will determine how much you receive out of the 55% that is allocated to all the states. So using Lagos as an example again, under the proposed model, 20% of 55% is 110 billion naira, and shared equally among 36 states, every state will get 3.6 billion naira. And then going with the population, 20% of 55% is 110 billion if there is 1 trillion generated by the federal government. And shared by population, Lagos State actually accounts for like 10% of the population, and so Lagos State gets 11 billion. But now here is where the chunk of the money comes from, which is the 60% from derivation. So 60% of 55% is 330 billion. And based on that contribution, Lagos State gets 165 billion naira. So let's look at a little bit of an explanation. Under the old model, using 1 trillion naira as an example, Lagos State will get 71.94 billion naira. But under this proposed model, Lagos State will get 179.06 billion naira. So the method of distribution is what actually changed in this proposed model, that try to put more emphasis on derivation. That is, the more amount you contributed will determine how much you receive, which in some senses actually aligns with fiscal federalism that is being practiced by first world countries. So let's use, aside from Lagos, let's use Rivers State as an example. So under the current model, 50% of 50% is 250 billion. Every state gets 6.94 billion. In terms of population, Rivers State account for 6% of the population and they get 9 billion. But under derivation, Rivers State contributes like 20% and then they get 20 billion. And 20% of 50% is 100 billion. So they get 20 billion. But now, under this new proposed model, Rivers State will receive 3.6 billion because 20% goes for 20% goes for population, and so 110 billion, they only have 6%, so they get 6.6 billion. And in terms of equality, every state will collect 3.06 billion. But when it comes to derivation, Rivers State will actually collect 66 billion. So let's look at the difference. Because Rivers State is contributing, we have 35.94 billion for Rivers State under the current model, but under the proposed model, we have 75.66 billion for Rivers State. But now, this is where the knot comes in. In a state like Kano, that the contribution to the VAT is just 2%, or even sometimes below 2%. What is the impact? Let's look at it. In the current model, 50%, every state gets 6.94 billion. And in terms of population, Kano State actually has a high population. And 30% from 50%, because of the population, they get 16.5 billion naira. And when it comes to derivation, they only get 2 billion naira because they are contributing just 2%. But now, under the proposed model, equality, the one that we shared equally, Niger State will receive 3.6 billion. Every state, that's what every state will receive. And in terms of population, they still get a lot because they count for 11% of the population, so 12.1 billion naira. But under the derivation, they only get 6.6 billion naira. And let's see the difference. In the current model, they get 25.44 billion in 1 trillion, and in the proposed model, they get 21.76 billion. So this model is actually trying to move Nigeria from shared equity to developmental equity, that you produce to get, you don't just receive. And this aligns with global practices in fiscal federalism. Even in the US, in Canada, in Australia, state actually controls the natural resources. But we have many natural resources in Nigeria and many northern states that are not being put to use. They are just lying dead dormant. But of course, it is actually the federal government that controls the natural resources in every state in Nigeria. But they give the revenue that is generated from there is actually accounted for. And under this proposed model, because they've increased the derivation to 60%, so states that actually are using their natural resources, states that are tapping from their natural resources, are actually going to get more. It's trying to increase healthy competition between states to make use of what they have. This bill is actually something that I believe on an aspect is good, but in some other aspects it has some disadvantages, but it has many more advantages than the disadvantages that it has, because some states who has a greater level of population may not be able to provide the necessary public service in education, in health, in security that their state actually need. But of course, even the security is actually the occupation of the federal government in Nigeria. But talking about some public services that the state actually handles, they may not have enough funds, but still I believe the state population actually is on the side of the northern government to still receive a large chunk of money from this the federal government. And with the introduction of this, it will encourage states to state actors to liaise with businesses, bring in businesses, create an environment that is thriving for businesses in their states, knowing that the revenue that you contributed will also be the amount you get back from the federal government will also be directly proportionate to the revenue that you generate in your state. So this is actually something healthy that we actually put every leaders on their toes to make sure that they partner with businesses, they make the environment of their state welcoming for businesses. States that are being bordered by insurgency, the governors will be on their toes to make sure that businesses are thriving, that insecurity is actually put at its barest minimum. And so those are some of the advantages that this can actually bring. It brings healthy competition. And one thing that I think is this will actually help the northern leaders to also focus on generating improving their people and encouraging education among their people, because we have some northern leaders who intentionally does not want the citizens, the people in the state, to actually be educated, because they benefit from the shared equity that we run in Nigeria. And if it's shared equity, then population is an advantage. So the most important resources in the nation is the human resources. But many, not all northern leaders, but many northern leaders actually intentionally do not want the people in their state to be educated, because education actually leads to productivity. But many of these leaders intentionally limit their people from getting the required education, and so human resources are not put to good use, because the greatest resources in every state are human resources. And I will give you examples.
While I was working with the National Assembly, there was a particular lawmaker I met. I'm being deliberately vague here because it's still in the National Assembly. We were talking one day, and he said, he said, Doctor, I said, yeah. He said, do you notice that many of the longest serving lawmakers in the National Assembly are from the North. I said, I have not done the research. He said, yes, most of them are from the North. I said, why is that? He said, you see, the problem with you Southerners is, when he said there are too many educated and qualified people in your constituency. So after you've done one term, 10 people are already queuing up to tell you, get out of the way, it's my turn. He said, but in my own area, I'm the only graduate and I love it that way. So imagine giving that lawmaker the job of reviving education in his community.
And so the North should actually invest in education, invest in everything that can bring about productivity, so that we don't have a large youth population in the North who are not producing anything. The northern youth are actually hardworking youth, but they need help from the government. They need people to align with their interests and build the capacity that is needed for productivity. And so that's what I want to share with you in this video, and I hope you've been able to learn a lot. If you have any questions, you can put it in the comment section. This is Entrepreneur Hub. We are talking about finance, making money online, talking about digital skills and everything an entrepreneur needs to know. And hopefully see you in subsequent videos. This is Entrepreneur Hub.